Ever get that feeling, like you're talking, but nobody's really listening? Or maybe you're the one zoning out mid-conversation. Happens to all of us, right? Communication is this tricky thing that can like make or break relationships, careers, basically life,
Hmm.
So I've been deep diving into this book, 21 Days to Effective Communication, and it's packed with all these research-backed tips and exercises to help anyone become a better communicator. And it's been pretty eye-opening, let me tell you. Speaking of eye-opening, I had this moment recently with a friend. She gave me this really thoughtful gift, and I kind of blurted out, "Oh, it's nothing really. Anyone could have done it." Ugh, classic self-deprecation, right?
Mm.
But she stopped me. It was like, "Hold on, you're amazing. Own it." It was a little embarrassing, but also like a light bulb moment.
Mm.
And it kind of ties into what this book really dives into, understanding the why behind our communication habits. One of the first things that jumped out at me was this emphasis on action. It's not just about reading and nodding along. It's about actually doing the exercises to like rewire those communication patterns. You know how sometimes you read a self-help book and it's all, yeah, yeah, be more confident, but then you close the book and nothing changes. This one's different. It's like having a personal trainer for your communication skills. And here's where things get really interesting. The book dives into how our childhood experiences actually shape the way we communicate as adults. Like, think about it. If you grew up with parents who were, let's say, super passive aggressive, you might have unconsciously picked up those same habits. And for those who need a refresher, passive aggressive is basically when someone expresses anger or negativity indirectly instead of being direct. So, like, they might give you the silent treatment or make sarcastic comments instead of just saying what's on their mind. The book even shares this story about Jenny, this lawyer who struggled with being assertive. Turns out her mom was really passive aggressive growing up, so Jenny learned that speaking up for herself wasn't okay. But get this, she eventually turned things around. She started observing other assertive women in her firm and basically, like, copying their behavior. Pretty cool, huh? It really makes you realize how much of our communication style is formed way back when, without us even realizing it. Those little things our parents said and did, they can have a huge impact. And speaking of impact, the book also delves into generational communication styles, which is fascinating. It basically says that baby boomers, Gen X, millennials, Gen Z, we all have different communication norms based on the world we grew up in. For example, boomers tend to prefer face-to-face interactions, while Gen Z is all about that digital life, even in the workplace. Imagine trying to have a serious conversation over text with a boomer. They'd probably be like, "What is this sorcery?" Yeah, but seriously, think about how much miscommunication can happen just because of when someone was born. It's like we're speaking different languages sometimes. Now, aside from all the deep psychology stuff, the book also has a bunch of super practical tips you can start using right away. Like, did you know that saying thank you, sincerely and specifically, can actually boost happiness for both the giver and the receiver? It's not just being polite, it's like a happiness hack. There's actually research from UC Berkeley that shows gratitude releases dopamine, so both people end up feeling better. Then there's this whole section on how to stop trying to score points in arguments. Like, seriously, what's the point of winning if you damage your relationships in the process, right? The book helps you reframe your thinking and focus on building stronger connections instead of just being right all the time. It's about understanding that maybe, just maybe, you don't have to have the last word, you know? Oh, and it has this awesome advice on how to ask for advice effectively. Instead of just like dumping your problems on someone, the book suggests framing it as seeking their expertise. It even gives you specific steps to follow, which I found super helpful. It's like instead of saying, "Ugh, my life is a mess, help," it'd be more like, "Hey, you're so great at X. Could you share some insights on how to approach Y?" People are way more willing to help when you approach it like that, right? And you know how sometimes you get stuck talking to a really nosy person? The worst, right? Well, the book has some hilarious but practical tactics for those situations. My favorite is the bore them rigid technique. You basically answer their questions in the most mind-numbingly boring way possible. Picture this. Someone's grilling you about your weekend, and you launch into this super detailed description of organizing your spice rack alphabetically. Guaranteed, they'll be running for the hills. But really, what I'm taking away from this deep dive is that effective communication isn't about becoming some kind of perfect communicator. It's more about understanding the why behind our habits and then consciously choosing to communicate in a way that builds stronger connections. The book's conclusion really stuck with me. It basically says that growing your communication skills is a lifelong journey. It's not like you reach some magical endpoint where you're suddenly a communication guru. It's about constantly learning, adapting, and refining your approach. You know. So now that we've gone on this deep dive together, what's one communication habit you're going to focus on changing today? What's a small step you can take to start making a difference? Take a moment to think about it. Okay, so we talked about some pretty cool tips from 21 Days to Effective Communication. But you know what really blew my mind? This whole chapter on expanding your vocabulary. I mean, I thought I had a decent vocabulary, right? But this book makes a strong case that the more words you have at your disposal, the better you'll be at communicating. Kind of makes sense, right? The book cites this fascinating research by a linguistics expert who found a direct link between vocabulary and career success. People who scored higher on vocab tests were more likely to land those high-level positions. Makes you wonder if they give out dictionaries at those fancy executive retreats, huh? But it's not just about sounding smart. A broader vocabulary actually helps you understand complex information better, which is super helpful in pretty much any job, right? So how do you actually expand your vocabulary? Well, the book has some surprisingly simple yet effective tips. One is to try using a new word every day. Look one up in the morning, maybe while you're sipping your coffee, and then try to slip it into a conversation throughout the day. It might sound a little forced at first, but hey, at least you're learning. And there are tons of apps and online games that can help. My personal favorite is this one called Free Rice. It's a multiple choice vocab game, and for every question you get right, they donate rice to people in need. So you're expanding your vocabulary and doing some good in the world. Win-win. Speaking of winning, the book has a whole chapter on the power of replacing but with and. You know how we often say things like, I want to go on vacation, but I'm scared of flying. The author points out that using but can be super limiting because it creates this wall between you and your goals. You acknowledge the desire, but then immediately shut it down with an excuse. Instead, she suggests swapping but for and. So it becomes, I want to go on vacation and I'm scared of flying. Feel the difference. It's subtle, but it shifts the energy from feeling stuck to exploring possibilities. Maybe you could try a road trip, or maybe you could face your fear of flying head on with some therapy. And get this, the book also talks about the magic of yet. Adding yet to the end of a negative statement can completely change the meaning. Instead of saying, I can't speak French, you say, I can't speak French yet.
Such a small change, but it makes a huge difference in your mindset. It's like you're acknowledging where you're at, but also leaving room for growth and possibility. I'm not there yet, but I'm working on it. Okay, another thing that really got me thinking was this chapter on pronouns, specifically how often we use I when we talk. The book mentions this wild study where they had people talk about a topic of their choice for 5 minutes, and guess what? The more narcissistic people used I way more often than the less narcissistic ones. Now, before you start counting how many times I've said I in this episode, the author makes it clear that using I isn't always a bad thing. It's totally fine when you're being assertive or expressing a strong opinion. But in everyday conversations, she suggests trying to cut down on the I talk and use we more often. It's a subtle way to create a sense of connection and build rapport with the other person. Instead of saying, I had a great weekend, you could say, we had a great weekend, even if you're talking to someone who wasn't there. It's like you're inviting them into your experience and making them feel more included. And here's a fun fact.
Apparently, we misinterpret the tone and meaning of emails up to 50% of the time. Can you believe that? That's why the book dedicates a whole section to mastering email communication. It gives practical tips, like mirroring the tone of the person you're emailing, keeping your subject lines concise, and even adding a little humor to lighten the mood. We've all been on the receiving end of those super curt or passive-aggressive emails, right? Nobody wants to be that person. So the book really emphasizes the importance of being mindful of your tone and making sure your message comes across clearly and respectfully. Because let's face it, sometimes a poorly worded email can create more drama than a face-to-face conversation. You know? Okay, I know I'm throwing a lot of info at you, but there's one more thing I have to share from this section. It's about the art of giving help and asking for advice. Now, I consider myself a pretty helpful person, but I learned some interesting nuances from this book. Instead of saying, let me know if you need anything, which can be kind of vague and puts the onus on the other person, it's better to be specific and take initiative.
You could say something like, "Hey, I noticed you're swamped with work. Can I help you with that report?" And it shows genuine care and willingness to help rather than just making a half-hearted offer. And on the flip side, when you're asking for advice, the book stresses the importance of framing it as seeking someone's expertise rather than just venting or dumping your problems on them. And this is key. Be clear about what you want to achieve. Don't just say, "I'm having trouble with X." Tell them specifically what you're hoping to learn or what kind of guidance you need. Like, "Hey, I know you're a pro at social media marketing. Could you give me some advice on how to grow my following?" Mm. Shows respect for their time and expertise and makes it easier for them to help you. Now, what if you need advice but you don't know anyone who's an expert in that particular area? Well, the book has some smart tips for that too, like doing your research and finding someone online who's willing to share their knowledge. Maybe someone who's written a blog post or created a course on the topic. The key is to be prepared, respectful, and don't be afraid to put yourself out there.
Okay, so remember how we were talking about generational communication styles? Well, get this. This book, 21 Days to Effective Communication, actually breaks down each generation and gives you specific tips for communicating with them effectively. It's like a cheat sheet for navigating those sometimes tricky generational differences. So let's start with the baby boomers, those born between 1946 and 1964. The book says they're all about face-to-face communication, and they really value recognition for their hard work. So if you're dealing with like a boomer boss, it's probably best to schedule an in-person meeting rather than just shooting off an email. And don't forget to acknowledge their contributions and experience. They really appreciate that. Then there's Gen X. They were born between 1965 and 1980. They grew up with more economic uncertainty, and they're all about that work-life balance. The book says they're more independent and not as concerned with company loyalty as boomers are. They also appreciate direct communication and regular feedback. So no need to sugarcoat things with them. Just be straight up. And of course, we can't forget about millennials, or Gen Y, as some people call them. Born between 1981 and 1997. They're the digital natives, the ones who grew up with the internet. And they're used to instant communication. So don't be surprised if they prefer to, text or email rather than actually talk on the phone. And they're really big on feedback too, so make sure you're giving them regular updates and letting them know how they're doing. Finally, there's Gen Z, the youngest generation. They were born from 1998 onwards. Super tech savvy, right? They value diversity and inclusion, and they're all about that side hustle life. The book says they're very aware of their online presence and might prefer to communicate in ways that don't leave a digital trail, especially when it comes to sensitive topics. So if you're trying to have a serious conversation with a Gen Zer, it might be better to, meet in person rather than texting or emailing where it can be scrapshotted and shared. It's a lot to keep track of, right? But it's pretty fascinating how our communication styles are shaped by the times we grew up in. And, understanding these generational differences can really help us communicate more effectively with, everyone in our lives. So there you have it. My deep dive into 21 Days to Effective Communication. This book has given me a lot to think about, and I'm already starting to put some of these tips into practice. And it's really cool. It's not just about becoming a better communicator, it's about becoming a better human. Because at the end of the day, communication is all about connection. And those connections are what make life richer and more meaningful, right? What's one thing you learned from this deep dive that you're going to try out in your own life? What resonated with you the most? What are you going to work on first? Think about it. And until next time, keep learning, keep growing, and keep connecting.